Glasgow has been called the most exciting city in the world. It claims to be the industrial, commercial and intellectual heart of Scotland. In a country of 5.5 million, Glasgow embraces nearly 1 million of that population. The city, like its people, is renowned for true Scottish hospitality, generosity and warmth of welcome. And just as its people are full of exciting contrasts, so is its architecture, well worthy of its crown, City of Architecture.
I'm sitting in a chair next to a fireplace in Proven's Lordship, the oldest house in Glasgow. Perhaps it's the same fireplace that Mary Queen of Scots sat by when she came to Glasgow and stayed at the house in January 1567 while visiting her sick husband, Lord Darnley. But perhaps the most remarkable fact about this building is that it's here at all.
Most of Glasgow's medieval and the 16th century heritage has disappeared, swept away by 17th and 18th century developers. In the latter part of the 20th century, the city planners did make some mistakes, but perhaps fewer than elsewhere. The city is still paying that price, but who could argue that the classical, neoclassical, Victorian and Edwardian grand designs are anything but a positive contribution to Glasgow's highly individual architectural character?
The building behind me was once owned by tobacco lord William Cunningham. It's in the commercial heart of Glasgow City. The city was built on the ruins of medieval Glasgow with money earned from sugar, tobacco and cotton, commodities that owed their profitability to the exploitation of slaves in America. This fine mansion, currently being transformed into a gallery of modern art, was financed with capital withdrawn from the Americas and reinvested in Scotland's own industrial revolution.
Glasgow's industrialisation started with the water-powered cotton industry. But soon new capital was financing the exploitation of Scotland's raw materials, iron ore and coal. Crofters and crofters' sons walked the high roads and low roads to join the swelling workforce, manning machines which were moving Glasgow and what was to become the industrial conurbation surrounding the city, out of the 19th and into the 20th century.
Glasgow was really moving, and in more ways than one. In 1894, Glasgow Corporation assumed municipal control of the tramway system. But bitterness between the corporation and the Glasgow Tramway and Omnibus Company prevented it from acquiring their existing fleet of trams. So work was immediately begun on the construction of brand new horse-drawn trams, 384 of them, the absolute ultimate in lightweight transport, at the grand cost of £143 each.
Alas, in a few short years, horse-drawn transport had become inadequate. And in 1898, the first of 21 new electric cars were completed. 120 of the horse-drawn trams were also converted to electric operation, staying in service until after the First World War. Like dinosaurs of prehistoric times, electric trams became the dominant species in Glasgow, sailing effortlessly through its streets, offering a frequent and regular service. They do say that reckless Highlanders were caused to wave their caps at them in Sauchiehall Street as these monsters of a modern age glided past with consummate environmental friendliness.
Originally a relatively shallow tidal river, the Clyde had to be widened and deepened to satisfy the demands placed upon it by all the manufacturing industries that sprang up along its length, not the least of which was the building, maintenance and refitting of warships.
On its banks were founded the greatest shipbuilding industry in the world. 25% of all ships that sailed the seas of the British Empire had their keels laid in Glasgow. And every time a captain called from bridge to engine room, the Scottish engineer answered. The sea lanes of imperialism were patrolled by the dreadnoughts, invincible armour-plated monsters born on the Clyde, and the spoils of industrial might returned to the Empire's second city. The distribution of wealth was, as always, uneven, but the affluence of these travellers at Weems Bay is clear for all to see. There are ship's officers and the well-dressed ladies in expensive hats. Dresses sewn by the skillful hands of Glasgow's seamstresses, the suburban gentleman and his wife in their so well-cut clothes. Look at the set of that overcoat. One can almost hear the tap of their Glasgow handmade shoes on the station dials. And there's enough money in Glasgow purses for a trip on the Caledonian paddle steamer, leaving Gourock Bay for a day out. And perhaps there'll be a dram in the saloon as the wee wifey watches the wains. And always the perennial pleasure of sand castles on the beach. Even if overdressed Edwardian respectability did not permit casual clothes, these children and families enjoy a day out or perhaps even a summer holiday at Dunoon West Bay. The day we went to Rossio to see the Pierrots at the end of the pier show. They are not, of course, singing Glasgow Empire favourites, but discreet melodies for a family show. And after the Pierrots and Pierrettes, a stroll along the esplanade to view the latest technological innovation, the monoplane. They didn't know that they were looking at the future. At Ettrick Bay, there's more sand and donkey rides in the western sun. A more expensive pastime is yachting on the Clyde. And you can hoist a sail to cruise past one of the rich men's steam yachts, more than likely built in the Clyde, with money from linen or bleach or sugar, or Britain's first chain of grocers' shops, or 100 different profitable commodities or artefacts Glasgow's workers could turn their hands to. Or you could just end the day like these little Edwardian mermaids, with a climb among the seaweed and the crab-infested pools on the rocks at the river's edge. Back in the city, there's an outing to Rooken Glen for the kids and mums of Springburn. Fun days out that are few and far between for Glasgow's city kids. On the other side of town, it's Sunday on Great Western Road, and the pavements are thronged with Glasgow's suburban middle classes from their 3 to 4 story tenement blocks. Can they still be called tenements? Hindland Road and Byres Road, Falkland Street and Annisland up to Hill Head, and perhaps a few from Kelvin Grove. Not for them, thank God, the 80 in 1,000 child mortality rate in the Gorbals. But for now, let the clerks, shipping agents, teachers, accountants, and officer soldiers confidently tread the flagstones, and the children hop and skip, avoiding the cracks. For across the German Ocean, Kaiser Bill was going to blow all those Edwardian Sundays away. In 1914 came the guns of August, and the Highland Light Infantry marched off to that big picnic at Ypres and Armentières, Arras, Auchinvilliers, Festubert, and the Somme, where the pipes called Scottish boys from the trenches into the hell of no man's land. Scotland has always had a strong military tradition, but this time Glasgow fought the war with her industry just as much as with her men. And for the first time, women were making a vital contribution. After victory, there would be a coming home fit for heroes. Yet so many didn't come home. For those that did return, there were no victor's laurels. And there were jobs for only a few. Boom had turned to bust. No one had heard then of the peace dividend. The great capital industries that Glasgow thrived upon were the first to go in the Depression. If work was to be found, it might be in the railways, but as England had just won control of Scottish Railways through LMS, that too dried up. There might be work on one of the puffers made famous by Neil Monroe, like this one, passing under the Jamaica Bridge.
Glasgow University, one of the oldest and greatest universities in Britain. It was moved here to this new building in the 19th century after having stood for over 400 years in the old city of Glasgow. Now, if there's an institution that remains basically the same in form and content throughout the land, it's the University Rag Procession. At least in the Glasgow of 1926, there's a real Scots pipe band and Scots men and women in Scots dress.
As they say, when Greek meets Greek, they open up a restaurant. When Englishman meets Englishman, they dress up as women, and maybe there are a few here. There's no consideration given to political correctness. The Empire stereotypes make good subjects for this charity fundraising event. It must have seemed like taking in each other's washing, as the children of the onlookers must have sorely needed the charity they were subscribing to. While Glasgow's workers struggled with unemployment, or for those lucky enough to be in jobs with massive cuts in their pay packets, cuts that were to cause the general strike. In other parts of the city, life went on. Perhaps there's one important concession being made to historical reality. The lorries these students were mounted on were, we hope, Albions, made in Glasgow. No, this isn't another Student Rag Week float. It is the Benny Railplane. This futuristic venture had a short life on 426 feet of LNER track. It was the brainchild of George Benny, who later formed the Airspeed Railway Company to further his project. The monorail and the cigar-shaped carriage were powered by push-and-pull air screws driven by aero engines. The engineering was done by Errol Johnson and Merlis Watson. There were plans to have a line to Edinburgh and one from Blackpool to Stockport. There was even talk of a line from Djibouti to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. But Mussolini would pay paid to that. Mussolini and his pal Hitler put paid to quite a lot of things. Even the Great Queen's project had been abandoned during the Depression, and number 534, later the Queen Mary, had been years rusting. The dereliction of 534 was perhaps one of the greatest disappointments endured on Clyde Sound. The decision to build the Queen had been greeted with expectations of jobs for life. It was only when the project was revived that Glasgow and Clydebank were convinced that economic recovery was on its way. There were wage packets once again, and workers' pride was rekindled as they walked down the road to John Brown's yard. There were commentators who said the results were visible in weeks as children went from bread and dripping to proper food, and housewives began to shop again. It is perhaps ironic that the first full passenger complement Queen Mary was to have were American soldiers. She ferried thousands of GIs from the States to Guruk when America entered the war. She and her sister ship's great Glasgow-built engines gave them the speed easily to outpace the fastest German U-boat.
Glasgow and Clydebank went into the Second World War full steam ahead and paid for it by being a prime target of the Luftwaffe. This is the memorial to Clydebank citizens at Dolnotta Cemetery, killed by enemy action in 1941. Only 7 houses were left undamaged in Clydebank during the Luftwaffe Blitz.
These children at Winchborough Gala Day in August 1942 could well have been the children of some of the victims of the Blitz. As it is, they look well-fed and well-dressed, with the sun shining on both them and their home guard onlookers. So, they waved their Union Jacks for the camera, and we are glad that they did, for this picture of wartime Scotland bridges time. Ginger has never tasted so good to these innocents caught up in the terror of a war they just do not understand. Their smiling mums enjoy a moment's escape from reality. There are few dads. They are either away on war work or overseas.
Within a couple of years, some of those Glasgow dads would be with the 15th Scottish Division in Normandy. Landing a few days after D-Day, they were thrown straight into the front line for Operation Epsom, in what became known as the Scottish Corridor.
As the assault on Caen floundered on the gentle slopes of Hill 112, the 15th Scottish Division held the flanks of the salient open in the face of determined attacks from 2 German panzer divisions. In some of the most bitter and bloody fighting of the war, the Scots simply refused to be overrun. Their stubborn resistance, in the face of overwhelming odds, cost them nearly 3,000 men. Many now lie in the Saint-Monvieux cemetery. Private J.G. Lamond. Was he killed by a bullet, shrapnel, a mine? W. Dunn. How did he die? Did he have a wife and family? Below each simple gravestone lies the body of a soldier, a man for whom someone, somewhere, still grieves. They shall not grow old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. With the end of hostilities, there was an optimism, an assurance even that times would get better. The river that runs through the city both joins and separates it. On that river, between the bridges, plied the Cluthas, the passenger ferryboats that carried Glasgow's ordinary folk backwards and forwards in all weathers and all seasons. There were, of course, other ways of getting about. Glasgow has always been justly proud of its publicly owned transport system, which includes, of course, an underground railway, nowadays called the Clockwork Orange. So proud of the network were the corporation, they even commissioned a film to celebrate their range of transport services, both past and present. Glasgow's trams were still in the forefront of civic pride. This film was made nearly 20 years before they were finally taken off the streets. Let Glasgow Flourish was the ironic title for an attempt made to tell the story of poverty in post-war Glasgow. This is a description of life in the Gorbals. For many, their post-war aspirations were not being met. The film was made in 1951. Little had changed since the First World War. This close was, like thousands of other Glasgow slum closes, the short, narrow yard and passage leading up to 3 landings and through to a grassless, broken brick back court with a small communal washhouse. In such back courts, the women of the tenement took their weekly turn in the washhouse and hung out the family washing. They were the only playground of many thousands of the city's children. In them, youngsters played football and children's games, climbed on the midden and washhouse roofs, and escaped death or injury from the perilous traffic in the streets. The film narrative tells its story in pictures. How a little girl is struck down directly as a result of having nowhere to play except the streets. She dies in the family's single-end tenement in a little box bed. In contrast, this next film shows how the same environment and culture can be romanticized and in fact made almost lyrical.
This is the Clyde at Glasgow, a hustling, bustling waterway given over to trade, commerce and industry. Cranes, wharves and warehouses crowd both banks of the river at Glasgow, where the Clyde becomes one of the world's great waterways. Here, ships of all sizes and nationalities load and discharge their cargoes. Tugs, small in size but stout of heart, are a familiar sight on this stretch of the river as they nose in and out of dockland, the network of quays, basins, sheds and railway sidings that make up the port of Glasgow. Puffers, too, have their place in dockland, for these dumpy little maids-of-all-work carry their cargoes right up to the shallows under the city's bridges. In Dockland, even the cats go about their business with a serious, purposeful air. The dockers, with a forest of cranes to help them, handle each year, on an average, 6 million tons of goods brought from or dispatched to every quarter of the globe in ships of all sizes and classes. And the seagulls? Well, they keep an eye on things. In a port the size of Glasgow, general cargoes include practically everything, from nuts and bolts to railway engines. Upriver from the docks, the Clyde is crossed by many bridges. This is a suspension bridge for pedestrians only. And this is one of the many bridges which take the city's traffic over the river. Downstream, back in the center of the dock area, there are ferries instead of bridges. Passenger ferries nose their way from bank to bank at various points along the river. And there's always something about the shipping to catch the eye on a ferry crossing. These ferries provide on the river the kind of service that buses give on the road. They're small, they carry only a limited number of passengers, but they cross and recross almost continuously, all day long. The passenger ferries save many people a long roundabout journey, up one bank of the river, across the bridges, and down the other bank. By ferry, they just go straight across. In addition to the small passenger ferries, there are big ferries for cars and lorries. These are useful not only because they're a shortcut, but because they bypass the crowded city bridges. Occasionally, the ferries have to wait for ships to pass up or down the river, just like waiting at the traffic lights. The streets of Dockland are as bustling and traffic-laden as the Clyde itself. The horse-drawn lorry still plays its part in the transport of goods, slower perhaps than car, van or diesel lorry, but an important link nevertheless in Clydeside's haulage system. Docks mean ships, ships mean seamen, and seamen like to have a home ashore when their ship's in port. Seamen's missions, another familiar sight in Dockland, provide just such a home, where a good bed and good food can be had at reasonable prices. Everywhere in Dockland, and at all hours of the day, there's an air of busyness. The rumbling traffic on the quayside streets, the throbbing engines of the tugs on the river, the staccato din of the shipyards on the banks. But there's more to it than this. The pattern of life in Dockland is woven from many different strands. A few people have time to stand or sit and stare.
Oh, indeed, kind sir, it's the truth I tell ye. I'm a bleacher last
But most people go about occupied, busy with their own affairs.
Oh, there she goes, peely heels and pointed toes. Look at her feet, she thinks she's neat, black stockings and dirty feet.
In Glasgow, shipping and learning rub shoulders, for the university is only a stone's throw away from the docks and looks down on Kelvin Grove Park, a green oasis amid the city streets and buildings. To step out of Kelvin Grove Park is to step into the workaday world of dockland. There are the workmen, on their way to or from the ships or wharves or railway sidings, the men who keep the port of Glasgow going. There is the traffic, the ceaseless stream of vans, lorries, buses, trams and private cars that rumble over the bridges from early morning until gathering dusk. And there is the river itself, strangely beautiful in the gloaming, when ships and sheds and bridges and buildings are silhouetted against the evening sky. This is the river, which not so long ago was a shallow salmon stream, and is now a great international waterway. The river which gave rise to the saying, "The Clyde made Glasgow," but Glasgow made the Clyde.
Since I loved a sailor, it's 7 long years since he gaed awa', and 7 times 7 I'll wait upon him and bleach my clays here on the Kelvin Hall.
Post-war, there were great plans for Glasgow as the reality of slum squalor remained. Slum clearance had begun in the 1930s and was considerably assisted by the Luftwaffe, but it wasn't until the 1950s that it was given urgent priority. Glasgow had plans to build a city and new town of and for the future. There are some among us who are perhaps thankful for the changes in population, government and economic conditions that caused such plans to be filed in the waste paper basket. Then came the 60s and 70s and the age of the motor car and the motorway.
Glasgow's highway plan proposes a 4.5-mile inner ring road round the centre of the new city, making the central area easy to bypass, fast to get into, fast to get out of, more accessible. On June the 26th, 1970, a symbolic stage of this crucial development was reached when Her Majesty the Queen Mother opened the largest urban bridge in the United Kingdom. Built at a total cost of £11 million, the Kingston Bridge has a span of 880 feet over the waters of the Clyde. Its 5 northbound and 5 southbound lanes will carry 70,000 vehicles a day in 1975, 120,000 a day in 1990.
It was said that Glasgow would be destroyed only to provide a means of entering it and leaving it. There were 75 miles of urban motorway planned for the region. London, a metropolis of overstatement, only planned 35.
In 1960, work began on the biggest urban redevelopment program in Europe, a 20-year program involving 5 square miles, a 12th of the city's area. Between 1960 and 1970, 52,000 houses were demolished in Glasgow. A further 75,000 are scheduled for demolition up to 1980. To make room for new life in the city, for new houses, industries, schools and colleges, hospitals, social and cultural amenities, for new roads linking a planned and integrated community. Noise, dust, confusion, the sometimes painful transformation of familiar landmarks. This is Charing Cross. Victorian grandeur, the Duke of Wellington, and a bank for the 1980s. The best of the old keeps its place in the new Glasgow. Glasgow's overspill means that in 1980, the population of the city will be 800,000 people. They will have good houses and a revitalized environment that will free them from the cramped conditions of the past. Sir Basil Spencer's high-rise flats in Hutchison Town, Gorbals, the first of the comprehensive development areas. At Ibrox and in other parts of the city, low, medium, and high-rise housing are grouped together. The future of any city develops out of its past, and this is not forgotten in the process of change. Some of the best of Glasgow's traditional 4-story sandstone tenements are being modernized. But as Glasgow prepares for the 21st century, the pattern of life changes. Tenement life, with its gilly pieces and wee shops, is disappearing. In its place, shopping precincts, located with new housing and new roads in mind. Shopping 1980 is convenience, safety, supplying the needs of material and physical excellence. Glasgow made up for not inventing football by creating Celtic, Rangers, and the Hampden Roar. The city also has a strong schools and club rugby tradition.
Well, that was the forecast on film for 1980. So much for predictions. It was before the Thatcher years, responsible for what has been called the deindustrialisation of Britain, and Glasgow, as always, was first in the firing line. It was before that most successful of all publicity campaigns, Glasgow Smiles Better, before the 1990 European City of Culture. So much is yet to change for Glasgow, and there are those eager for change, but many others nostalgic for the old Glasgow and the old Clyde, and a trip down the water from the city that is the gateway to Scotland.